Warning. This video contains spoilers for Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion and the Karamari Hospital and Dollhouse DLCs. If you wish to play this game spoiler-free, viewer discretion is advised. The opinions expressed in this video are the official opinions of Cawthorne Communications Incorporated. Please enjoy the video.
Do you have an interest in the macabre and archaic that you just can't seem to shake? Does your incessant curiosity lead you to make life-threatening choices? Then explore the derelict mansion on the hill. What's in there? Ghosts? An endless labyrinth? Monsters? Hell if we know. Visit today and find out for yourself. The Mansion on the Hill. Book your vacation today.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mr. Cawthorne's Reviews. As always, I'm your host, Calvin Cawthorne, CEO of Cawthorne Communications Incorporated and host of the Cawthorne Communications Twitch channel. Today, we're covering a game that is both an affectionate parody of the horror genre, as well as a horror game in its own right. Today, we're talking about Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Now, before we get into it, I just want to mention that this game has two DLC expansions called Karamari Hospital and The Dollhouse. If you're playing the original version, which is free on Steam, then you'll have to buy them, or you can just buy the HD renovation, which includes full 3D graphics and comes with both DLC included but costs money up front. And, unlike Little Nightmares, we're going to be covering the full game today, the original story mode and both expansions. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Given that this game is an affectionate parody of the horror genre, you'd expect that the game doesn't take itself all that seriously. And, for the most part, you're absolutely correct. However, there are moments in this game that are most certainly not played for laughs. For starters, the beginning text scroll is fairly ominous and almost sounds like something out of a H.P. Lovecraft story.
For as long as you can remember, legends have been told about the derelict mansion upon the hill that casts a blanket of darkness over the town. The history of the house itself is virtually unknown, and even the town's oldest residents cannot remember the mansion's origin. Being an avid history enthusiast, you embark up the mountain to visit the manor, hoping to shed some light on the backstory of this crumbling fortress of darkness.
Which is then accompanied by a soundtrack befitting such ominous text. You start the game and are greeted by Spooky, who challenges you to survive through 1,000 rooms of her mansion, and then immediately leaves. No further expounding, no explanation of anything going on here, just survive 1,000 rooms, bye! And the entire game, Spooky only ever says a line or two before she phases through the ceiling, to the point where even one of the in-game notes acknowledges it. So, you proceed forward, going through a lot of the same rooms, over, and over, and over, and occasionally, little cardboard cutouts pop out from the wall, making noises. At first, you might assume this is all there is to the game, and you'd probably only assume this when the game first came out. Then, you come across a room with a puddle of slime on the ground. You read the note, and suddenly, you hear the raspy choking of this thing! So, you run for this thing that chases you through several rooms, leaving slime puddles that slow you down, and then, all at once, it stops. That's right. There are actual monsters in this game. In fact, there's a total of 13 monsters, each met at different points, and each has its own chase theme. And most of them come back. So, here's a list of them in order of meeting them. Specimen 1 is the cardboard cutouts. Yes, they're actually a specimen, much to everyone's surprise. And apparently, they've even managed to kill 3 people. Its main threat? Appearing when other monsters are chasing you, which causes you to suddenly stop. Which, if a monster is right behind you, can kinda be a problem. Specimen 2 is the aforementioned goo monster. He can only really get you if you start to dilly-dally. If you just keep moving, he really can't hurt you. Specimen 3 is a creepy spider-pede that crawls through holes in the ceiling in addition to chasing you. He's found in an area called GL Labs, which stands for Generic Laboratory Labs. Clever. Specimen 4 is a Sadako copy you meet in an abandoned school. She eats you if she kills you. I found a concerning amount of fan art about this while trying to make thumbnails for VODs of this game. She also gets 2 new and scarier forms in Endless Mode. Specimen 5 appears to be a relative of Pyramid Head. You meet it in the Dark World from Silent Hill. Its main gimmick is making the walls all red and staticky, which makes the rooms hard to navigate because it's harder to see where the walls even are. Specimen 6 is a reference to both the Happy Masked Salesman and the Ben Drowned Creepypasta. His gimmick is that he doesn't move while you're looking at him, meaning you effectively have to walk backwards while he's chasing you, and he'll more than likely get a few hits in during the process. Specimen 7 is an advancing wall of doom who is preceded by a surreal environment straight out of the Persona series. In fact, this monster seems to be a reference to the version of Nyarlathotep from that series. It warps the walls too, and makes the doors disappear, but they still work. Specimen 8. Oh dear God. I'm serious. That's what this monster is. You meet them in a forest full of carnivorous deer. They chase you to simulate you to feed its children. Specimen 9 is a skull-shaped mass of clay. You don't really learn much about it. It's implied it may be linked to Japanese Unit 731, and I'll let you do your research on that one, but it's not pretty. You only really meet it if you stand still too long without pausing, or you get stuck in a suspicious endless hallway, which can actually really catch you off guard if you don't know what to look for. And then, it pulls a "this isn't even my final form" at the end of the game and turns into the final boss. Specimen 10 is a reference to aliens and undead horror all at once. Its area looks right out of Dead Space. It's another GL Labs facility, if you can believe it. And you have to stay close to this one because if you get too far away, it changes into a form that's much faster than you and will guaranteed get a hit on you before you can get to the next room. Specimen 11. You meet this creature in an abandoned fast food restaurant.
Taste the beef.
I'm guessing this is Ronald McDonald's true form. He can make doors vanish. In the HD version of the game, he's slower, which makes him much easier to deal with, but he still has the single most ominous chase theme in the main game. I mean, just listen to this. Specimen 12, this guy's intro area is the actual specimen. Turns out the guy chasing you is just possessed by it. His whole gimmick is that he has the same limitation as the player, and he's pretty easy to deal with. Like most of the monsters, just keep running and you'll be fine. Specimen 13. You meet this one, a clear reference to sirens, in an underwater lab. Her chase area is flooded, so your movement is limited. But there's crates to jump on where she can't get you. Most of these monsters are fairly easy to avoid if you just keep running, and your health regenerates over time, so as long as you can go a while without taking a hit, you're never really in that much danger. You also find the notes of previous victims of the mansion, implying that the mansion is constantly changing and shifting, as well as some well-placed fridge horror hidden behind the humorous writing.
Ink. Not quite quenching my thirst. Taste is terrible. Stains are terrible. I don't think drinking it was a very romantic idea. No, I'd reckon it wasn't. I found something today to satisfy my unromantic thirst. I awoke today from a brief faint and found before me a bottle of red wine. I'm not sure what brand or year, for there is no label. All I gather is that it tastes strongly metallic. That sounds like you're drinking blood. I don't think that was wine. Well, it was metallic tasting, so I bet it wasn't wine either.
And then, you make it. You reach the 1000th room. You finally escape. Only to find it was a dirty, dirty trick. Then, you are told to fight Specimen 9's ultimate form. You beat him, and depending on the actions you took after you got the axe, you either have the ceiling fall on you and join an army of ghosts Spooky has been gathering this whole time, or you become a specimen yourself. And this all really just depends on how you use an axe that you get a pretty good way into the game, believe it or not. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but that's kind of all there is for the story of this game. I think out of all segments, the main game played the parody part of Affectionate Parody the hardest. But let's get into the other two sections of the game, which actually expound upon the backstory a little bit. The Karamari Hospital DLC seems to take place after the main game, and it's actually left ambiguous whether or not you're the same character as in the main story. So, you enter an elevator that proceeds to drop like it's the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. Speaking of, I'll never forgive Disney for repainting it into a Guardians of the Galaxy ride. They replaced a wonderfully executed mock-up of the classic Rod Sterling monologue with goddamned Chris Pratt. How dare they? Anyway, now that my brief rant's over, after you drop, you wander through a few of the typical rooms you've seen literally 1,000 times by now. And you wind up in a hospital lobby. There's cheery music, and nothing looks outright terrifying unless you are just naturally scared of hospitals.
Well, this is just pleasant.
You buzz yourself in, and are free to roam around. No one's here. Then, you go downstairs and turn the generator off. And that's when the music goes spooky and you find that all is not right in this hospital.
Oh no, we're in the dark world.
In fact, it's all wrong! You encounter spooky chairs, security officers with club arms, a madman in the basement, and a weird coffin dude. Notes indicate that there's some sort of possession going on with the staff, and they're all going insane.
Nurse Tanaka, report 487. It wasn't me. I swear it wasn't. It may have been my body and my hands, but I know it wasn't me.
At the end, you find out this is where Spooky died and became a ghost. Then, when you reach the exit, Spooky herself appears and tells you to explore the depths of the mansion further. And with that, the first DLC concludes. Compared to the main game, it's not actually all that long. It can be done in, I'd say, an hour if you really know what you're doing. And even though it is a lot shorter than the main game, I'd argue it's a lot scarier because the atmosphere keeps up throughout the whole thing. Anyway, after that, we move on to the final DLC and the final part of the Spooky's Jumpscare story, the Dollhouse. The Dollhouse starts much like Karamari Hospital. Yet again, you start wandering through typical rooms, unsure if you're the same person as the original game or Karamari Hospital, until you reach what looks to be an old person's house, judging by the doilies, curio cabinets, and tea sets.
Oh hey, there you are. I was wondering where you were. I had forgotten about this place. So many tortured souls are here. Well, anyway, I'm gonna go check on something. See you later.
You find a doll, which you learn is actually your health pack in this game, because here, your health doesn't regenerate. And you need to keep her happy at tea rooms, otherwise she loses her healing powers, and you get attacked by a shadow creature called Frenzy, which I was not expecting and actually got pretty startled by when it appeared. As you explore this house, you encounter a squishy monster known as Wormy Charles. A monster clown that doesn't really ever attack you, so far as I know. A bunch of little doll things called husks. Another doll with a bunch of nails and chains sticking out of her. An optional final showdown with Specimen 11, or Specimen 4 if you're playing the Dollhouse from the original game, Specimen 8, or Specimen 6. And a bunch of amorphous blobs vaguely shaped like soldiers. You eventually learn that this is yet another generic laboratory labs facility, and may have in fact been the first of those facilities. All the monsters that you've been seeing throughout the whole game, from the base game until now, are the result of a hellgate that Spooky's father opened up, to try and bring back his dead daughter. But, as it always does with this sort of thing, something went horribly wrong! You perform a ritual that involves a game console for some reason, and summon one of the 3 previously mentioned monsters, and go through a slightly altered chase sequence that closes the Hellgate. He also basically sacrificed himself to bring her back as a ghost, but she came back wrong.
I always wanted to tell you how that night really ended, but I couldn't, because you were gone. That's why I wanted you back at any cost. But in the end, I robbed you of both life and unlife. Please go on. Be with Monica. I'm sorry.
You go into the nightmare he gave to whatever this relic is, and you find out that Spooky's dad's the one who killed her in a fit of PTSD.
Is that Spooky?
And then, he put the gun on a homeless man lying on a bench, because he couldn't help but punch down on a man already having a hard time, apparently. And, after you exit the nightmare, you've got to sprint to the exit before the whole place explodes.
Now seems like a good time to run! Hello, Spooper! I don't care what your deal is!
And, after that, you get 2 possible endings depending on whether or not you close the Hellgate beforehand. If you close the Hellgate, congratulations! You freed all the souls trapped in the mansion, and you get treated to a very wholesome shot of Spooky with her parents in, I'm assuming, heaven. But, if you didn't close the Hellgate, you kickstarted the apocalypse, because without the mansion, there's nothing containing the horrors coming through it. So congratulations, you just ended the world! And that's the end of the story. Except for Endless Mode, which continues some of the note-taker stories, but other than that, it's just kind of a fun arcade mode. This game, in its original version, was meant to invoke a sort of false retro style, with mostly flat sprites that sort of follow you, sort of like in an old FPS game like Wolfenstein 3D or Doom, which wasn't completely carried over to the HD renovation. The new models look great, don't get me wrong, but I personally felt that it made the game lose just a bit of its charm for it. But don't get me wrong, it's still charming on its own, but in some ways the HD kind of ruined the style it was going for. Also, since the game is a parody, it does a good job of referencing a lot of typical horror tropes. A lot of the time, it's not going to be particularly scary. It's more silly than anything.
Ashes to ashes, bones to flames. Your hopes will slowly turn to ashes.
That being said, there are moments where the game does manage to be foreboding and scary, which I will list some of the others as follows since I already went over the little text scroll at the beginning. So, the majority of the specimen introduction chambers do a good job of hyping up the monster and making them seem like a genuine threat. The problem is that outside of these rooms, the horror aspects of them start to die down a little bit, especially since 9 times out of 10, actually more like 9 out of 13, you can get away from these monsters just by sprinting to the next room as quickly as possible with no other real strategy needed. The exceptions being Specimen 6, who you have to constantly have in your sights, otherwise he's going to jab you, Specimen 10, whom you need to stay semi-close to prevent him from switching to his faster form, and Specimen 13, who chases you in floating hallways, meaning you have to jump on boxes and try and avoid her in the water. They fix some of these encounters with the Hellgate encounter in the dollhouse, where you have to rematch with a few of them, and their chases change because of it. Karamari Hospital manages to be concerning all the way through due to its consistent atmosphere and compelling lore. There's very few points where you feel safe, whereas in the main game, it rarely feels as though you're in any real danger at all. The basement and the nightmare sequence of the Dollhouse DLC are also consistently scary, both because of the atmosphere and the minimal explanation regarding what's going on in both locations. And the explanation you get at the nightmare sequence is an excellently done shock moment, because it just ties everything together, and suddenly it all makes sense. Also, the main game gets very tedious very quickly, because while the specimen rooms are interesting, the majority of the game is just repeatedly walking through the same rooms over and over and over. Also, while we're on that topic, if you've got the time and the patience, you can play through the entire game with the specimens and jump scares off and get a joke ending that way. Just be prepared to suffer through being very bored the whole way through. Though, to give credit where it's due, the specimen rooms still manage to be foreboding even when their occupants aren't there. For a parody game, Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion has a surprisingly emotional story underneath the cutesy surface. The main problem being that this story isn't really told outside of the DLC. But knowing the story of the DLC when going back through the main game adds an element of fridge horror that comes from knowing the why of everything. Also, spoiler warning in case you missed the one at the intro, and you completely missed the story segment on the dollhouse. Spooky's dad shoots Spooky during an episode of PTSD, hinted to be either one of the world wars. He plants the gun on a homeless man to avoid being convicted for his crime. Spooky is then taken to Karamari Hospital where she eventually dies, and while she's there, her father founds GL Labs and begins experimenting, which indirectly causes the supernatural events that take place at the hospital. After Spooky's death, GL Labs focuses on bringing people back from the dead, which leads to the creation of the Hellgate, wherein most, if not all, of the specimens originate. And Spooky's dad finds an ancient relic to bind Spooky's soul back to Earth, but with a latent case of megalomania and an obsession with scaring people. So, in other words, all of this was caused by Spooky's dad going to any length to assuage his grief and guilt over killing his own daughter. If there were any moral to be drawn from the backstory, it's that dwelling on your guilt or grief can lead you down some really dark paths. I personally enjoyed Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. It's definitely not a perfect horror game, and as a parody, it's not really supposed to be. However, it's got a lot of charm and seems very aware of what it's going for. So, without any further ado, let's go over how I'd rate different aspects of the game. For gameplay, the game only gets a 1 out of 5. Most of the monsters can be evaded by literally just running away, which means that each monster's unique gimmicks, barring few exceptions, don't really get a chance to shine. In addition, running through all of the rooms gets really monotonous after a while, regardless of how much you're having a good time. As for story gets a 3 out of 5, because while there is some good writing here and there, the notes do a good job of hyping up each monster, and getting the overall story of the game mandates buying and playing through the DLC, which I do recommend because they add some of the elements I found lacking in the main game. As for replayability, the game's very simple. There's alternate endings for each major part of the game, and there's an endless mode. With that, I'll rate it a 5 out of 5 because I have actually found myself returning to the game just to try and get the alternate endings and missed achievements in my spare time. However, I don't have footage of any of this. As for length, this one's kind of a tricky one because the main game drags on. But I'd argue that the DLCs are the perfect length, being far shorter, but not so short as to be unsatisfying. So I'll rate length a 3.5 out of 5 as sort of an average between the two. So, for total score, my accounting department calculated those scores out as a 3.13 out of 5. So, it's a pretty decent game overall. It's not a perfect horror game, and part of that's because it's clearly meant to be an affectionate parody of the horror genre first and foremost. It pokes fun at common horror tropes, but in a way that isn't mean-spirited in the slightest. Overall, in spite of being kind of middling, it's a game I would recommend to a friend.
As always, Corvid Communications Incorporated. Thanks you for your viewership. If you want to watch games live, please tune in to twitch.tv/Corvid_communications. Stay tuned for whatever game Mr. Cawthorne reviews next. At Corvid Communications, we won't leave you eating crow.